The streets of Liverpool in the 19th century were a world of their own. A maze of damp alleyways, towering chimneys belching thick black smoke into the sky, and cobblestone roads slick with rain. The city was alive with the sounds of hooves clattering against the pavement, merchants shouting their wares, and the distant wail of a ship's horn from the bustling docks. But beneath the hum of daily life, behind the lace curtains of modest homes and flickering gas lamps, lurked secrets far darker than the soot-stained buildings. In one such home, a woman lived. Not a woman of great wealth or noble birth, nor one whose name was sung in ballads or recorded in history books with admiration. No, her legacy was something far more chilling. She was a wife, a mother, a woman of faith, a member of the community, and a killer. Her name was Mary Ann Cotton. To those who met her, she was ordinary, perhaps even likable. A woman of quiet manners, with a soft voice and an ever-present air of grief. A grieving widow, a devoted mother, a woman who knew the deep sorrow of loss all too well. But there was something else, something almost imperceptible, lurking behind her sorrowful eyes. Death followed her like a shadow. It wasn't unusual for sickness to sweep through a household in those days. Typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, illnesses that claimed the lives of men, women, and children without warning. It was simply the way of life, especially for the poor. No one questioned when a husband fell ill, nor when a child wasted away in their mother's arms. It was tragic, yes, but it was not suspicious. At least, not at first. The tragedy that seemed to haunt Mary Ann Cotton was relentless. A husband, a second husband, a third, a fourth, each one taken too soon. Children, her own flesh and blood, succumbing to an unknown illness. Friends and acquaintances whispering, their eyes following her as she walked the streets in mourning black, her veil covering a face that never seemed to age, despite the tragedies that piled around her. How much misfortune could one woman endure? And yet each time, after the tears had dried and the mourners had gone home, Mary Ann would find herself in the same position. Standing in front of an insurance agent, accepting a sum of money in exchange for yet another life lost. A small price for such devastating misfortune, they thought. A widow must survive. But the deaths did not stop. Liverpool was a city of survival, of laborers breaking their backs in factories, of sailors braving the treacherous sea, of housewives stretching every penny to feed their children. People did not have the luxury of dwelling on tragedies that did not belong to them. And so, Mary Ann carried on, slipping unnoticed through the cracks of society, one funeral after another, until one day someone did notice. A pattern began to emerge, one that could no longer be ignored. The Black Widow of Liverpool was spinning her web, and her victims were tangled in it before they ever knew the danger. But no matter how carefully she planned, how softly she spoke, or how convincingly she wept, she had made one fatal mistake. And soon, her reign of quiet terror would come to an end. Mary Ann Cotton knew how to play the role of a devoted wife. She knew how to keep a household running, how to soothe a fevered brow, how to lace her voice with just the right amount of worry when speaking to a doctor. She knew how to grieve, how to clutch a handkerchief in trembling fingers, how to bow her head just enough to shield her face from curious onlookers, how to let a single tear slip down her cheek at the precise moment it would be noticed. She had mastered the art of loss. Her first husband, William Mowbray, had been a simple man, a hard worker. He provided for her, for their children, for the home they built together. But misfortune came swiftly. Their children, little ones barely old enough to walk, were the first to succumb. The doctor could find no answer beyond the usual suspects: typhoid, dysentery, consumption. It was a cruel world for the young. Mary Ann mourned as any mother would. Then, when William himself fell ill, it was devastating. A stomach ailment, they said, painful, drawn out. Vomiting, diarrhea, an unbearable agony that gripped his body until it finally let go, leaving Mary Ann a grieving widow. People pitied her. What kind of woman could endure such hardship? To lose not just her children, but her husband as well? They shook their heads, spoke of how unfair life could be, how cruel fate was. They did not see what lay beneath the surface. They did not see the way Mary Ann carried herself with just a little too much composure after the funeral. They did not see how quickly she moved on, how soon she found companionship in the arms of another man. Nor did they see the life insurance policy, one that had been signed not long before William's sudden illness. And so, when Mary Ann remarried, people saw it as a second chance, a fresh start. She was young after all, and a woman could not survive alone. It was only natural that she would find another husband, but the pattern repeated. Another man, another home, another stretch of time where life seemed peaceful, and then illness, vomiting, stomach pains, a slow, agonizing descent into death. Another funeral, another insurance payout. Some whispered that Mary Ann was unlucky, that she was cursed. Others said she had been through more sorrow than any woman should bear in a lifetime. But no one dared to say what was becoming more and more obvious with each new tragedy. The deaths were not a coincidence. And Mary Ann Cotton was not an ordinary widow. She was something else entirely. She was patient, calculating, and above all, she was not finished yet. It always started the same way. A slight discomfort, no more than an upset stomach. Nothing alarming, just a bit of indigestion, perhaps from spoiled meat or bad water. The kind of sickness that came and went, something to be ignored in a time when illness was a part of daily life. But then the discomfort grew. The pain sharpened, twisting deep in the gut like a knife being slowly turned. What had begun as a mild inconvenience became something far more sinister. The victim, whether it was a husband, a child, or anyone who stood in Mary Ann's way, would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, clutching their stomach as waves of agony ripped through them. They would vomit, again and again, until there was nothing left. And still it would not stop. Their body would reject everything, food, water, even the smallest sip of tea. And Mary Ann would be there, hovering at their bedside, dabbing their forehead with a cool cloth, her expression one of deep concern. She would shush them gently, stroke their hair, whisper reassurances in the darkness. "It's just a passing illness," she would murmur. "You'll feel better by morning." But morning never brought relief. Instead, the sickness worsened. The pain became unbearable, their bodies weakening as they withered away, limbs trembling from the strain. The doctor would be called, but by then it was always too late. The symptoms mimicked so many common diseases: cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery. In an era where death was an everyday occurrence, where even the healthiest could be snatched away without warning, no one questioned the cause. It was simply bad luck. And Mary Ann Cotton was the unluckiest woman in Liverpool. Or so they thought. The truth was far more chilling. The truth lay in the quiet moments when no one was watching. In the cups of tea she so lovingly prepared, in the bowls of broth she spoon-fed to the dying. The truth was a white powder, dissolved without a trace, a poison that worked slowly and visibly, eating away at the body from within. Arsenic, a killer with no scent, no taste, a perfect murderer's tool. It could be slipped into food, stirred into a drink, hidden in plain sight. And Mary Ann knew exactly how much to use, just enough to mimic disease, just enough to keep suspicion at bay. And when death finally came, when the body lay cold and still, she would weep. She would cry for the husband she had lost, for the child who had been taken from her, for the cruel fate that seemed determined to haunt her. She would play the grieving widow to perfection, and then she would collect the insurance money and move on to the next victim. Poison is a patient killer. It does not strike with fury like a blade, nor does it shatter bones like a hammer. It whispers its destruction, creeping through the body with cruel precision, dismantling life from the inside out. It does not scream, it suffocates, and when the world finally notices its work, it is too late. Mary Ann Cotton understood this better than anyone. Her weapon of choice was simple, elegant, and utterly undetectable. Arsenic, a powder as white as sugar, dissolving seamlessly into tea, broth, or porridge. It had no smell, no taste, no warning. Once swallowed, it began its slow, merciless assault, mimicking the very illnesses that plagued Liverpool's overcrowded slums. The first few doses were harmless, or so they seemed. A touch of nausea, an unsettled stomach, nothing that would raise suspicion. But Mary Ann was careful, methodical. She did not rush. She allowed time to pass, let her victims believe they were recovering. And then, just as they began to trust that their sickness was behind them, she would administer another dose, and another. Until the body turned against itself, until the stomach twisted in unbearable knots, the muscles seized in agony, and the victim's own breath became an unbearable effort. And all the while she would be there, standing over them, watching. She played the role of the devoted wife, the caring mother, the dutiful nurse. She would press a damp cloth to their forehead, hold their trembling hands, whisper soothing words as they moaned in agony. She would feed them spoonfuls of soup, knowing that each bite was a death sentence. No one suspected a thing. After all, she had suffered so much loss herself. People pitied her. She was a woman who had buried too many loved ones, a woman whose life was marked by tragedy. When her husbands died, the neighbors shook their heads and whispered of misfortune. When her children perished, the community grieved alongside her. And yet, beneath the black veil of mourning, behind the tears that dampened her cheeks, Mary Ann Cotton remained as calculating as ever. Because grief was profitable. With each death, there was money. Insurance policies, inheritance, sympathy offerings. A widow with a family to support was expected to accept financial help. No one batted an eye when she took what was rightfully hers. And with every shilling that passed into her hands, she grew bolder. But even the most careful of killers cannot keep their secrets forever. And Mary Ann Cotton was not as invisible as she believed. Some were beginning to notice the pattern, and the silent killer in the teacup was about to be exposed. Whispers have a way of spreading, seeping into the cracks of a town like the damp fog that rolls in from the Mersey. They slip through the alleyways, pass between clasped hands at market stalls, drift beneath the flickering glow of gas lamps. And now, the whispers had a name. Mary Ann Cotton. At first, the rumors had been little more than idle gossip. A woman who had lost so many husbands, so many children, how could such misfortune befall a single person? Some pitied her, others avoided her, fearing that the bad luck clinging to her like a funeral shroud might be contagious. But not everyone believed in curses. Some believed in something far worse. It began with the insurance clerks. Men who did not know each other, who worked in different offices across the city, who never had reason to speak. And yet, one after another, they found themselves staring at the same name on a policy. Mary Ann Cotton. Each time, the story was the same. A husband, healthy and strong, taken suddenly by illness. A child, no more than a few years old, wasting away in their mother's arms. And then the claim filed promptly, efficiently. A grieving widow, seeking what was owed to her. 1 policy was nothing. 2, unfortunate. 3, a cruel stroke of fate. But 5, 6, 7, it was not fate. It was something else entirely. The whispers reached the doctors next. The men who had signed the death certificates, who had diagnosed the fevers and stomach ailments, who had offered their condolences and moved on to the next patient. In a city riddled with disease, they had not thought twice about the cases before them. But now, they began to reconsider. The symptoms, always the same. The drawn-out suffering, the violent sickness, the hollowed faces of the dead. Not typhoid, not dysentery, not cholera. Something else. Something they could not see. And there was always one constant. Mary Ann Cotton. Her name clung to the dead like a specter, a silent figure at every bedside, her hands ever so gentle, her voice ever so kind. A woman who nursed her loved ones into their graves. But suspicion was not proof. There were no witnesses, no smoking gun. No blade covered in blood, no bottle labeled poison sitting on her shelf. There was only doubt. A creeping, insidious doubt that slithered into the minds of those who had once pitied her. And doubt was not enough to stop her. Not yet. Because Mary Ann Cotton was still free. And she was not finished. Not by a long shot. Mary Ann Cotton had played the game for years. She had wept over coffins, worn her mourning black, and collected her payments with quiet dignity. She had mastered the art of deception, of turning suspicion into sympathy, of making tragedy her most profitable companion. But even the cleverest killers make mistakes, and Mary Ann was about to make hers. His name was Frederick Cotton, a simple man, a widower with children who needed a mother. He was steady, reliable, everything Mary Ann required in a new husband. And most importantly, he was insured. Their courtship was brief, it always was. Mary Ann knew how to weave a story, how to make a man believe he had found a devoted wife. She spoke of her own losses, of the hardships she had endured. She played the part of a woman who longed for stability, for family. And Frederick, like the others before him, believed her. The wedding was quiet. The home they built together was modest. But Mary Ann was not interested in love, nor in a future. She was interested in what she had always been, control. And soon Frederick fell ill. At first it was nothing, a touch of stomach pain, a bit of fatigue, easily explained, easily dismissed. But Marianne knew better. She had seen it all before. She had caused it all before. She moved through the house like an angel of mercy, tending to her ailing husband, spooning broth between his lips, pressing cool rags to his forehead. She played her role to perfection, just as she had so many times before. Frederick's condition worsened. His body betrayed him. Violent sickness, endless pain. The doctor came and went, shaking his head. Another case of gastric fever, he muttered. Nothing to be done. And Marianne? She waited. Waited for the inevitable. Waited for the moment when Frederick Cotton would take his last breath. Waited for the funeral, for the insurance payout, for another clean escape. But this time, something was different. The whispers had grown louder. The people of Liverpool were watching. The neighbors saw how quickly Frederick Cotton had withered under his wife's care. The doctor, who had once seen only disease, now saw a pattern. The insurance agents, too many, too often, began to ask questions. And Marianne Cotton, for the first time, felt the walls closing in. But she was not finished yet. There was still one last obstacle in her way. A boy, her own stepson, a child who had seen too much. And in Marianne's world, loose ends had only one fate. Marianne Cotton's world had always been one of control. Every death, every claim, every calculated move, each piece had its place, its purpose. She had orchestrated the fall of husbands, the deaths of children, the sickness of anyone who stood between her and her desires. She had played the widow, the grieving mother, the devoted wife, but there was one thing she could not control. The child. Her stepson Charles had watched it all. Charles was not a child of Marianne's making. He had been born to her second husband, Frederick, the man who had become her final victim. The boy had been young, but old enough to understand that something was wrong. Old enough to notice how quickly his father had deteriorated, how strange it was that his stepmother, who had once seemed so kind, was now always hovering by his father's side. It was Charles who first alerted the neighbors when Frederick's illness began to worsen at an unnatural rate. It was Charles who spoke of the strange things he had seen, the way Marianne had given his father medicine, the cups of tea, the broths. It was Charles who remembered the odd, quiet moments when his father had seemed to struggle for breath after every meal, after every sip. But no one had listened, not at first. After all, he was just a boy. His voice was small, his accusations dismissed as the ramblings of someone who didn't understand. It was nothing more than childish imagination, the adults had thought. But Charles knew. He had seen too much, felt too much, to ignore the truth any longer. It was the night Frederick finally died that Charles decided to act. He was just a child, too young to carry the burden of truth alone, but old enough to understand the weight of what was happening in his own home. He sneaked away into the darkness of the street. With trembling hands, he ran to the nearest constable's house, banging on the door in the dead of night. The constable had been startled at first, not knowing what to make of the frantic child at his doorstep. "What's this, lad? What's the matter?" I saw it. I saw her do it. She's poisoning him. She's killing father." The constable had raised an eyebrow, doubt in his eyes. He had heard the rumors, the talk of a woman who seemed to bury every man she married. But a child's accusation was hardly cause for alarm. Still, something about the boy's face made him pause. "Who?" he asked, the word barely a whisper. "Marianne Cotton," Charles replied, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "She's poisoning him. She killed my mother too. She killed them all." The constable looked down at the boy, who was shaking with fear and exhaustion. His small hands were clenched tight, fists trembling as he spoke the words that had weighed on his heart for so long. And in that moment, something changed. The whispers, the suspicions, the doubts, they could no longer be ignored. Charles had given voice to the truth. Now the hunt for Marianne Cotton would begin. It was a moment of reckoning. A single trembling voice, the voice of a child, had thrown the darkness into light. In an instant, the rumors that had swirled around Marianne Cotton began to solidify into something more dangerous, something undeniable. The constable, whose skepticism had momentarily held him back, could no longer turn away from what had been whispered in the shadows for so long. The boy's words rang with a chilling clarity. She killed them all. The constable wasted no time. He knew the law could not be swift enough. So, with the urgency of a man who felt the weight of history pressing upon him, he gathered a small team. Officers, local doctors, men who had seen enough of the deadly sicknesses that plagued the city to know when something didn't add up. They began to investigate. Mary Ann Cotton's past was dredged up, piece by piece. Each husband she had buried, each child she had lost, was scrutinized anew. Death certificates were pulled from archives, old medical records were reopened. What had once been deemed a string of tragedies, a string of misfortune, was now laid bare for what it truly was, a pattern. A carefully executed pattern of deaths, each one following the same course. The investigation led them to the final blow. The poison, the arsenic, the chemical compound that had once been used for everything from rat poison to cosmetics. It was commonplace in 19th century homes, easily obtainable, but lethal in the wrong hands. Mary Ann Cotton's hands. As the evidence piled up, the people around her began to turn. Neighbors, who had once seen only a grieving widow, now whispered of the woman who had hidden her deadly secrets behind a mask of compassion. They remembered the late-night visits to the house, the quick transactions with the undertakers, the hurried manner in which Mary Ann collected insurance payouts. The more they spoke, the clearer the picture became. But still, Mary Ann remained calm. She had been in this position before. She had played the role of the innocent woman, the sorrowful widow, too many times to count. The facade was so well worn, so perfected over the years, that she believed she could slip away once again. But this time, there was no escape. The constables arrived at her home, and it was there, in the same house where so many had taken their final breaths, that they arrested her. She was calm, almost serene in the face of the charges. There was no panic, no last-minute plea for mercy. She simply allowed herself to be taken, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Her capture sent a shockwave through Liverpool. A woman, a mother, a widow, who had deceived them all, who had played them like puppets in her deadly game. But it was only the beginning. The trial would reveal the full extent of her crimes, and the world would come to know her name. Mary Ann Cotton, the Black Widow of Liverpool, had finally been exposed. When the news broke, it swept through Liverpool like wildfire. The arrest of Mary Ann Cotton, the woman whose face had once been a mask of mourning, was a scandal that no one could ignore. What had once been whispered in hushed corners, what had been the rumors of a grieving widow, was now public knowledge. The name Black Widow became synonymous with fear and betrayal. The trial was the event of the year. People came from all over, packing the courtroom, eager to witness the downfall of the woman who had played them all. Her once charming demeanor, her practiced sorrow, no longer held the same power. She was no longer the sympathetic widow. She was a cold-blooded murderer. The woman who had poisoned her way through life, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake. Mary Ann Cotton sat at the defendant's table, her face impassive, her eyes devoid of any visible emotion. She was calm, composed, as though she had rehearsed for this moment, as though she had been waiting for it her entire life. She never once looked at the victims' families, the grieving husbands, the orphaned children. She did not flinch as the damning evidence was laid bare before her. The prosecution, armed with testimony from doctors, neighbors, and the brave child, Charles, painted a chilling portrait of the woman who had deceived them all. They spoke of the deaths that had followed her like a dark cloud, of the husbands who had vanished from her life with suspicious speed, of the children who had died in her care. They spoke of the arsenic, the white powder that had been her silent accomplice, a poison so deadly and so insidious that it had allowed her to continue her murders without a trace. Each witness, each victim's family member, added another layer of horror to the case. And as the trial dragged on, the weight of the evidence became too much for even Mary Ann to ignore. Yet she never broke. Throughout the trial, she maintained her innocence. She claimed to be the victim of a misunderstanding, the target of malicious gossip, the unfortunate recipient of a world full of grief. She expressed sorrow for the loss of her loved ones, though the words rang hollow. They were the words of a woman who knew her fate, a woman who understood that her time was running out. The defense tried, weakly, to argue that the deaths had been from natural causes, that there was no proof of foul play. But the jury was no longer listening. They had seen the pattern. They had heard the truth, and the truth was too powerful to ignore. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom held its breath. Mary Ann Cotton, once the grieving widow, once the woman who had escaped death's grasp time and time again, now faced her own. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a death knell. It was a sentence of finality, the end of a long, dark chapter in Liverpool's history. Mary Ann's expression did not change. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply stood as the judge sentenced her to death by hanging, as cold and as distant as she had been through the entire trial. She was a woman who had long ago accepted the inevitable, who had walked through life with the quiet certainty that one day her actions would catch up with her. And now, that day had arrived. The days that followed were filled with a grim finality. The trial had concluded, and Mary Ann Cotton, the notorious Black Widow of Liverpool, was led to her fate. The city, once filled with whispers of her dark deeds, now held its collective breath. The woman who had killed so many with her delicate touch, with her poisoned tea, was about to face the ultimate consequence for her crimes. The gallows were prepared, a cold, unforgiving structure standing tall as the symbol of justice. It was there, beneath the gray skies of Liverpool, that Mary Ann would meet her end. On the morning of her execution, a crowd gathered outside the prison. People came in droves, eager to witness the final chapter of a story that had shocked the world. The whispers had turned to stares. The mournful sympathy that had once followed her was replaced with contempt. She was not the grieving widow anymore. She was the monster they had all feared she was. When Mary Ann was led to the gallows, there were no defiance in her eyes. No last words of remorse. She simply stood there, as still as the stone walls that surrounded her. And as the lever was pulled, as the rope tightened around her neck, the life that had once been filled with manipulation and cold-hearted murder was snuffed out. The Black Widow of Liverpool was no more. Her name, however, would live on. Her legacy would haunt the pages of history, a chilling reminder of how darkness can hide behind the most unsuspecting of faces. But in the end, justice had prevailed. The families of the many victims, those lost husbands and children, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The woman who had stolen so many lives, who had destroyed families in the name of greed, had finally paid the price for her actions. This is not just the end of a tale, but a lesson. A lesson about trust, about vigilance, about never allowing evil to hide in plain sight. The story of Mary Ann Cotton serves as a reminder that justice, though often slow, can be relentless. It serves as a warning that the truth has a way of emerging, even when cloaked in silence. And now, as we close the book on the Black Widow of Liverpool, we urge you to look closely at the world around you. Recognize the signs. Speak out when something feels wrong. Don't let the darkness go unnoticed. The truth, no matter how buried, will always find its way to the surface. In the face of evil, the only thing that ensures justice is our willingness to confront it. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and never ignore the whispers of truth, no matter how faint they may seem. If you found the tale of Mary Ann Cotton chilling and informative, be sure to share it with others. Stay curious, stay informed, and never forget that history has lessons to teach, if we are willing to listen.